Welcome to Biology of Marine Mammals. I'm Dr. Leslie Williams, and this is a continuation of cetacean foraging. As we continue this lecture, we'll look again at the mysticetes and their feeding techniques, beginning with the third and final feeding modality, which is suction feeding, employed by gray whales. And then we'll look at some general feeding strategies employed by the mysticetes and some of their energetic concerns, before finally briefly covering the odontocetes, how they differ from the mysticetes, and some of the cooperative foraging that we see within the odontocetes. So let's start with our third and final feeding modality. We recently covered skimming and gulping as two feeding modalities, and now we look at our third, which is suction feeding. Suction feeding is a type of feeding that is only seen with gray whales. So this one is unique to gray whales, though it's not the only thing that gray whales do. In suction feeding, what you're doing is you're getting a gray whale that's going to the bottom of the ocean, to the sea floor, and basically sucking up a bunch of mud. Because you're on the bottom of the ocean, and the word benthic means bottom, this is sometimes called benthic feeding. When that happens, they're basically sucking in a bunch of mud and then trying to capture any of the organisms that are within the mud by pushing out the muddy water through their baleen and trapping the organisms against their baleen. The result of this feeding is actually extraordinarily messy, and as such, from an aerial view, you can often spot a gray whale feeding by what's called their mud plume, which is shown in the bottom picture here. In other words, it actually looks like a muddy trail in what otherwise seems to be nice, blue, peaceful water, and that is evidence of recent gray whale feeding. So what type of food items do these gray whales hope to get? Well, when they do this type of suction feeding, they're mostly getting small crustaceans known as amphipods. Amphipods range anywhere from about the size of your pinky down to something so microscopic that it requires a microscope to view. And then with those, you might actually also get a bunch of worms. There's a lot of marine worms that tend to burrow in the mud. So you get marine worms and amphipods, but one of the unique things about gray whales is that they actually have extraordinary diet plasticity, which means that they're very, very good at being opportunist and kind of taking advantage of whatever is available. So while this is their primary mechanism of feeding, they are also known to feed on organisms in the water column, including small fish, which they will try to get through basically a primitive type of gulping or skimming, or even very small shrimp. And it's the shrimp that they are apparently after. If you ever see gray whales come in near a kelp bed and it looks like they're munching on kelp, they are actually munching on a little bit of the kelp. Kelp has been found inside of their guts, but they're trying to get some of the organisms that are around that kelp as well, which is really interesting. So it's thought that because they're able to kind of vary their diet so much depending on what's available, it actually has contributed to their success and recovery as a species. Gray whales, particularly those off the coast of the United States, have done particularly well in their recovery and are heralded as a success story in whale conservation. But again, it's thought that the fact that they're able to kind of utilize whatever food source is available helps them succeed. So with that, let's take a look at some general trends in baleen whale foraging, starting with when they feed. They don't feed year-round usually. Most baleen whales feed during a 4 to 6 month summer interval where they basically feed extensively. This is because this is when their food is going to be most abundant, and it tends to be at high latitudes. High latitudes again means towards the polar or colder areas. So you're going to see a lot of baleen whales in the Arctic and Antarctic circles during this time. And then during the other months, they actually migrate away towards warmer waters, which is why, for example, off the coast of California, the prime whale watching season is actually during the winter. They've migrated away from the colder waters and are moving towards warmer waters where they tend not to forage as much but do things like give birth or even just be with their species. They tend not to feed very much during that time. So during the months that they are intensively feeding, most whales consume about 4% of their weight per day, which is an extraordinary amount when you think about how much they weigh. And then when they are not feeding during the migrating times or when they're in warmer waters, they might feed a little bit, but not very much. So overall, per year, it's considered that if you look at the overall year, a whale consumes between 1 and 2% of its daily weight per day. So what about the energetics of baleen feeding? So it's important to note that these guys cannot be feeding indiscriminately. In other words, they can't just go gulping and sifting and suctioning wherever they feel like it. And part of that is because, one, they do have such a large daily caloric requirement, and two, because of their small prey size, each individual organism contributes very little to their daily need. Remember, these guys are going to be feeding on small things, krill, copepods, amphipods, etc. And because their feeding technique, particularly if they're chasing food, lunging after food, gulping food, and sieving, they're all very energetically expensive. So because of that, they have to ensure that when they actually do some type of feeding activity, that they're exploiting an area that has a lot of prey. They can't just say, well, I'll take a gulp here and see if I get 10 krill out of it, that's great. That's 10 more krill. Well, if you expended the energy that would have cost you 40 krill to pay for that activity, then you've actually lost in that game. So they need to make sure that they only feed where it's dense, which is probably one of the reasons why they don't feed very much during migration, because they just don't encounter the prey density that they need to make it worth it to expend all that energy. So let's contrast that with the Odontocetes. The Odontocetes, which of course have teeth, by very nature of having teeth, must feed differently than baleen whales do. Now, interestingly enough, you might think that Odontocetes need their teeth to feed, but that's actually not entirely true. Two exceptions to this are going to be the belugas and the sperm whales. So the sperm whales, even though they actually have teeth, don't seem to use them. They tend to feed through suction instead. But most Odontocetes do use their teeth for foraging, usually to capture or tear larger prey. And this is particularly true of the Delphinidae, which are the dolphins, which use their teeth pretty much exclusively for capturing fish or even larger prey like penguin and possibly other marine mammals. So what types of trends do we see in the Odontoceti foraging strategies? Well, first and foremost, we note that the prey of Odontocetes is necessarily larger than the prey of Mysticetes. So, for example, fish tend to be a staple of most Odontocetes, and large fish too, whereas if we see any Mysticetes consuming fish, they're very, very small. In many ecosystems, the Odontocetes are actually the top predators, so they're higher up on the food chain than their larger Mysticeti components are. Also, the Odontocetes tend to feed year-round. This is because the food supply tends to be year-round, and it's worth it to chase and capture a single food item rather than trying to go for a dense swarm of food. And finally, and possibly the most interesting, is that the Odontocetes tend to use cooperative foraging techniques. In other words, they feed together as a group, which is one of the reasons why Odontocetes tend to be found in schools. So they actually work together to try to maximize their ability to eat. And some of their techniques are really interesting, and I want to talk about them here. So we'll start with just our generic dolphins. These would be like common dolphins, white-sided dolphin, bottlenose dolphin. When you see a school of dolphins that are working together to forage, you'll often see them cooperate. What are some of the things they might do? If they're trying to basically herd a school of fish together, again, to get them in denser aggregation so that they have better luck capturing them, then you might see dolphins on the outskirts of that school do tail slaps. The tail slaps are meant to actually scare the fish towards the center of the school and herd them. Alternatively, you might see them actually leaping. So they'll leap around the perimeter of a school of a school of fish, again, to get those fish to the center. And It's even been known that dolphins can chase their prey to the shore. So if you do an internet search on dolphins and prey or dolphins beaching, you might find some interesting video of dolphins actually coming up on shore and herding their prey with them to get their fish to strand so that they can grab them a little bit easier and capture those fish. So they do some really interesting cooperative foraging. And again, remember, this is all done through echolocation. But of course, the most interesting cooperative feeding is done by the orcas. Orcas, which have many, many, many different feeding strategies, many of which are exclusive to certain pods or what are considered to be subspecies, demonstrate some of the most fascinating and interesting feeding strategies. I won't have time to describe them all here, but I'll try to describe a few of the more interesting ones. First and foremost, you might see on the left-hand side of this screen an orca coming up out of the ice. That's called spy hopping. What they're actually doing is trying to get an aerial view of what might be on the ice, such as penguins or maybe seals. And of course, on the bottom picture, you see an orca coming up actually on an ice floe to just go ahead and nab a seal that it probably spotted earlier during a spy hopping event. Not all orcas feed on marine mammals, however. Some actually feed on fish. We've actually been able to see orcas will flip upside down. And when they flip upside down, they show their white underbellies, which scare a bunch of fish towards the surface, which will allow other members of their pod to come up and actually consume that schooled aggregation of fish. So that's kind of an interesting technique they use. And of course, again, the ones that feed on the marine mammals use lots of very inventive techniques. On the very right-hand side of this picture here, we see 3 or 4 orcas all coming up together onto this tiny little ice floe which supports a Weddell seal. Now, what those orcas are about to do is create a gigantic wave. And what that wave will do is actually tip that ice floe over so that the seal goes into the water. And of course, one of the orcas will snatch it, drown it, and then they'll consume it. And of course, perhaps maybe the most famous and fascinating example of creative orca foraging strategy is done in Argentina by actually a very small number of orcas. These orcas, what they're actually doing is they're going to beach themselves in order to capture seals. So seals and sea lions, particularly new pups that maybe don't know any better or just starting to learn to swim, are exploring the surf, and these whales just ride in a wave, and they basically come out right onto the beach, grab a pup, and then kind of wiggle their way back in. Again, I encourage you to do an internet search on that, to look for orcas beaching themselves to capture seals, done by a very select number of orcas, not done worldwide, in a very specific location in the world in Argentina, but a fascinating strategy. So orcas, again, exemplify the ability to use a variety of foraging techniques to make sure that they meet their daily caloric requirement. And with that, I will see you next time.